I'm Matt.
And I'm Nate.
And this is Not Quite Religious, a podcast where a Christian pastor and former evangelical turned atheist have conversations about faith, religion, philosophy, and life while drinking coffee.
Welcome to episode 18, where we talk about a video that Matt watched on Schopenhauer and possibly Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. And also, so remember how a few weeks ago we were talking about how like elevator music would be great?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we can do this.
Waiting.
It's on the podcast. We don't have headphones in, so we can't hear it. But yeah, it turns out we have these effects that we can do.
Oh, good.
So, yeah. Fun times.
So now there's like elevator music in the background while we're talking?
I think there's like cheering. There's some sort of sound effect. I forget which one I pushed. I discovered it the other day.
Okay, so it just did a cheering sound effect for a second.
Yeah, well, these are the cheering ones.
Yay! I gotcha. Man, this show is great so far. It's not Schopenhauer. It's Schopenhauer. Yeah. Arthur Schopenhauer is a 19th century German philosopher, as they seem to all be, or at least the ones that I read. Was a big influence on a more famous philosopher known as Friedrich Nietzsche, if you've ever heard of him. So I was reading, watching, listening to things about Schopenhauer, and I came across something about his take on Christianity that resonated with mine and resonated with some things I was trying to say, I think all the way back in episode 2 or 3, whatever that one was, where we were talking about why Christianity is beautiful. And I re-listened to it this morning on my drive down here. And of course, the second time you listen to something is always different. You get a different impression almost, whether you watch or listen, whatever it is. It didn't quite have the second listen didn't quite have the same emotional impact. Maybe it's because it was the second listen. Maybe it was because I'm in a different place than I was like 2 months ago, which I tend to be, which is probably frustrating to people who want something systematic from me. I tend to be all over the place, tossed about by every wave of wind and doctrine. But still, I think I can give a pretty good summation of what Schopenhauer's view of Christianity is as versus Buddhism and Hinduism, and his view of the Old Testament versus the New Testament. And I think just explaining that will be pretty good fodder for an entire episode.
Sounds good.
We may or may not get to Dr. Horrible's sing-along vlog.
You might have to make it another episode.
Yeah. So basically, Schopenhauer says that the way to think about religion is not in terms of theisms. So theism, monotheism, pantheism, atheism, pantheism, panentheism, all these theisms. He says the best way to think about it in order to get at the truth of it is to think about it in terms of whether it has a pessimistic or optimistic worldview, or whether its worldview is essentially pessimistic or optimistic. And then later he'll talk about idealism versus realism. And what he has to say about Christianity is that Christianity is... Well, let me start with Buddhism. Buddhism and Hinduism for him are religions that are essentially pessimistic, which for him means they're closer to true. He says Buddhism is the closest religion to the truth that there is, but he gives some credence to Christianity, and he does so by comparing Christianity to Judaism. Which he admits Christianity is complicated by its affiliation it's inextricable affiliation to Judaism. Like, they share the same scripture. So in some sense, they can't be. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. Well, you can't talk about Christianity without talking about Judaism. Right. You probably could talk about Judaism without.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So, so he says Judaism is an essentially optimistic worldview, and he relates this in particular to the point about it's a material point. So in other words, Judaism's tenet in Schopenhauer's mind is right there in Genesis 1, God saw everything that he was made, and behold, it was good. And so in Judaism, the material world is good, and the fall is sort of what messed things up, and that's interesting, if questionable theology, but it's an interesting framework, and I don't know how far I want to go into that, because I don't think our podcast is a deep dive into any one particular religion, but that it's an interesting take. Insofar as Judaism wants to affirm that the material and the real is essentially good, I think that that's true. Yeah. And I also think Judaism recognizes that that's a paradoxical thing to say. So that's why Judaism is more like a dialogue than it is anything else, because they're fundamentally resting on the paradox of the material world that God made is good, God is good, and yet there's suffering. Yeah. And so that's the constant dialogue. Where he says Christianity / the New Testament is the solution to that
optimism
to that problem, and it's essentially pessimism in that it affirms it's the cross of Christ is the ultimate affirmation in Schopenhauer's mind that the material world actually is bad. Otherwise, Christ wouldn't have to have died for it. So that, in a sense, there's almost like that's the end of dialogue, and that's my own thought. That's not what he's saying. I'm just kind of riffing at that point. It's an interesting take. So he thinks that Christianity is
the nail on the coffin of
dialogue. Well, maybe it's interesting. That's not his point, though. His point, though, is one of the things what he likes about Christianity and why he prefers it to Judaism is that Christianity is rooted in a more real take, which is that the material world is actually bad, which he says is, is a more realistic take, and yet he feels like Hinduism and Buddhism both give a more full and all-encompassing and deeper have a deeper understanding of what it means to live in a material world that is essentially bad. So, like, where for Christianity this material world is temporary but still real. Yeah. In the Eastern religions, it's the material world is illusory. Right. And he thinks that makes it better. And so that's a summation of his philosophy, or his philosophy of religion, and that's what I heard the second time I went through it. And I think the first time I went through it, I was projecting some of my own stuff, and that's why I was so excited about it. Especially the idea of Jesus being this idea of Jesus being the end of dialogue. I mean, I guess I shouldn't strike anybody as the kind of person that's excited about the end of dialogue, but this idea of Jesus as an answer to a problem of suffering, and that the starting point is suffering, as opposed to the starting point being everything that God made is good. I think that corresponds with something of the idea that I was peddling at the beginning, as in terms of like how to approach Christianity theologically and philosophically. But I'll just stop there. There's so much more I could say, but I don't want this to turn into some kind of lecture. No, I think that's enough for us.
I think I definitely remember when we were talking about the different, or attempting to in 45 minutes summate the beauty that we find in our worldviews. And I definitely remember, like, at the end, you were like, no, like, my starting point isn't God, it's suffering. And then, so almost working backwards to God, so to speak, for you. Yeah, I mean, so I guess my thoughts are, I don't know, I'd have to probably go back and watch the video, but it's interesting because, you know, just as you were talking, one of the things is like, well, not only is reality illusory for the Hindu and the Buddhists, but their ultimate goal is to fully escape it, right? Where like Christian afterlife, so Jewish afterlife, Sheol, who knows? Right. Well, ask a rabbi and get an answer.
Let's dialogue about it.
Right.
What do you think?
But I mean, ultimately, it's, you know, the rewards in Judaism are here and now. Like, even for Job, like, yes, God is a jerk and kills all his family, but like his reward is like, you get more. Here's more of the stuff. Like, it's definitely material. It's definitely in the present.
But even then, I think there's a conversation about that from within the Hebrew Scriptures, because on one hand, you can from the Hebrew Scriptures, you can look at eternity as your posterity, as like the success of your children, and then there are other scriptures which just blatantly contradict that.
Yeah,
and say, I was reading one this morning, actually, Psalm 49, which is like, the only thing that the rich have going for them is like the posterity of their children, and that's not actually like anything they get to experience personally, or like it's not a good thing. And the writer of Ecclesiastes says as much the same. It's like, who cares if I leave my wealth to people that I'm never going to know? Like, I'm not going to know my progeny, so why is that some kind of blessing? So Hebrew Scripture is already questioning itself.
Right, but it is more focused. Like, the rewards are more focused on the here and now. Like, you know, especially when you think of the law and the Torah. Like, if you worship me, things will go well. If you don't, things will go bad. Where Jesus is like, don't store up your treasure, like your treasures in heaven.
Right,
like it's not here.
That's a clear contrast.
Stop looking. Stop. Right. And they're like, when are we gonna like kick out Rome? He's like, no. You guys don't get it.
Like, I'm talking about like denial,
right? And you know, Buddhism's like, we're gonna go a step further. Like, let's just join Nirvana and get the crap out of this cycle. Like, we want out. Where like Christianity is like, you can have a temporary out for now until it's all fixed, and then you'll get it back again.
Yeah, Christianity also sees redemption in suffering itself.
Yeah.
You know, like, so it's both a problem and a solution in Christianity. Whereas I think in Buddhism, suffering is part of the illusion that you're trying to transcend.
Yeah.
You're trying to get back.
Yeah, well, you're only suffering because you're believe in the illusion of reality and trying to make a name for yourself or feel hunger, like.
Yeah, and then this past year, I've been reading this book called "The Fruit of Our Lips" by a rather contemporary German theologian, philosopher, who taught at Dartmouth around the middle of the 20th century, but he's kind of a refugee in a way from Nazi Germany. His grandson actually lives in Putney, Vermont, which is 15 minutes from where I live in Brattleboro. And his grandson's the one that introduced me to his work.
Like, read my granddad.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, like, somebody gives you a book and you're like, yeah, I'll read this, and sometimes you're glad you did, and sometimes you're like, oh, okay, but this is one of those times I'm really glad I did. I was blown away by this guy's thought. His name is, you're never going to remember it. I'm just going to say it because why not?
We can rewind it.
Eugen Rosenstock Hussey. I think that's how it's pronounced. That's his name. You could call him ERH for short. But he had this interesting take that I think is in conversation with what Schopenhauer was saying in relation to Judaism and Christianity, especially as it pertains to the Gospel of Luke. But what he said was, there's this really provocative quote. Let me see if I can remember it. That Christ was killed because God needed to remain in the future.
I don't think I understand that.
Yeah. In other words, what I was saying about Christ being the end of the dialogue about suffering. So if the Hebrew Scriptures is a conversation about what's the afterlife, well, it's the rewards on earth. Well, no, actually, those don't matter. Why did God make suffering? So that we could grow closer to Him. But maybe it's maybe it doesn't matter. There's just all these conversations about suffering and theology, and then there's in the prophets in the Old Testament pops up this idea of a Messiah who is, it's ambiguous, but he's the Savior. But when he actually shows up, and what I like about what ERH is saying is that he's framing it as actually a deep psychological issue rather than just a contemporary problem. Like the first century Jews just had this bad theology about what the Messiah was supposed to do, and they thought he was going to be political and he was really spiritual, and they were really disappointed that he wasn't the political leader that they expected or wanted, so they crucified him. What ERH is kind of saying is that the Messiah as a concept is difficult for a point of view that always needs salvation to be in the future. It's sort of like you have a dream. A dream is in something you want to accomplish with your life. You have this idea and this vision of who you're supposed to be, and then you finally achieve it. You actually achieve your dream, and you go, now what? And it's a common thing with people who achieve their dream.
Right.
On the other side of that is depression.
Yeah.
So that's what he's saying is they crucified the Messiah because in order to keep God as a hope for the future.
That sounds heretical.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't put that on any official
Right.
I wouldn't want to say to a Jewish person, "Hey, here's your theology."
Yeah, no, I guess after you unpacked it, I understand what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
It's hope that you have isn't hope anymore.
Right.
Right. So hope by definition has to be longed for and something that you're striving towards, or I don't want to use hope to define hope, but hoping
right.
You hope for the promotion. Once you get it, it's just reality. And,
right. Yeah. So that's interesting in relation to Schopenhauer saying that Jesus is the solution. It's similar to Paul saying Christ is the end of the law for all those who believe. And I don't know, I find that to be a fascinating idea. And I wonder how it, and hinted at it, even though I don't think Schopenhauer went this direction at all. We're free to go on our own. I wonder if that has any relationship to Christianity, especially Western Christianity's. Maybe it's too strong to say obsession with dogma. So solutions.
Yeah.
And the idea that dialogue is actually a preservation of hope. Because if you're talking about something, then you're not at the end of it yet.
Right. So, I mean, are you sort of saying, the Western evangelical obsession with systematic theology and apologetics and, here's the pat answer and you don't need to talk anymore, and, don't talk to people who play Dungeons and Dragons? I think there's 80 different trails. I'm just trying to figure out which one you're...
I guess it's so much of it.
Yeah.
it finds itself in different expressions of Christianity.
Well, I mean, I think Americans, ironically, we're the most religious of the industrialized countries. I also think we're probably the least mystical of the and I say that having never lived other places, but like, and by mystic, I don't mean like Scottish fairies. I mean, like, when you think about how Americans eat versus how Europeans eat, right? You like pull in, you grunt your number to this drink. Number 2, extra lot, right? There's no like, there's nothing sexy about that. And you think about like, midday break in Spain. Like, all right, we're gonna have 2 hours. We're gonna go have tapas. We're gonna get some nice Chianti and some port, and we're gonna sip that while our waiter or waitress brings us multiple small plates that we share, and you have like a bite, and it just like tickles your tongue. Or like the French coming up with the amuse-bouche. Like, what is that? It's like let's amuse your mouth. Like, let's tickle your mouth before this, right? So like there is like a mysticism there.
Or even it's like a ritual,
a transcendence. Yeah, it's supposed to be bigger than you,
right? A recognition that eating is an opportunity to participate in the transcendent.
Yeah. Like it's not just about calorie intake, right. And Americans, I find for the most part, it's like calorie intake. Right. And so there is a spiritualism, and I mean, I'm using food obviously because I'm a chef, but like. There's something to it. Like I sit down at a night, like, it just changes everything when you go to a fine dining establishment. Not that you have to spend $1,000, but it's just like when you have to slow, and like the most transcendent experience I've ever had, I think, was eating at WD-50 for my friend Kurt's 30th birthday party. He's a foodie. So we drove all the way to New York City to eat at a Michelin star restaurant. Doesn't exist anymore because the rent got so high he had to close. But it was Wiley Dufresne, who's a molecular gastronomist. We got the tasting menu. It was 13 courses. It was like 4.5 hours. Everyone at the table, like the deal is like if one person ordered it, everyone had to order it because they're not. We had like 6 waiters. When you got up to go to the bathroom and came back, you had a new napkin refolded into a different like animal shape. The first course was a New York bagel with cream cheese, but he's a molecular gastronomist, so it was actually bagel flavored ice cream and cream cheese that he had gotten crispy, so that it was like a crunchy bagel. So it was like the opposite, and everything was like that. Like we had freeze-dried foie gras that had like a mango gelée inside. It was called like leftover. Like your fridge leftovers or something. I forget the exact name, but it was supposed to be like country fried chicken, mashed potato leftovers.
Sounds
it was
fantastic.
Like it was like squab. It was like all these plays on all these things, and you get to like the 12th course, and you're like, I'm full. I could not possibly have one more. And I don't know. You're probably familiar with Monty Python movies, right? You know, The Meaning of Life, where like it's just a Thin Mint. Well, like they essentially come out and they're like, here's chocolate leather. They're like, you've probably had fruit leather. They're like, Wiley Dufresne's the only person in the world who's figured out how to make chocolate leather at that point in time. So that it actually felt like fruit leather, but it was chocolate. And we're like, oh, we can't. And they're like, just trust us.
So where is this?
It was in New York City. It doesn't exist anymore. But they're like, just trust us. And you're like, I'm really full. Like, I've just had 12 courses over 4.5 hours. And they're like, and you have like that one more bite. And it was like, you're like, okay, now I'm actually full. like everything was timed, like absolute perfection. And it was... And then, like, you end and you go back into the city, and it's just, like, you just went from this, like, really holistic, spiritual, like, everyone's eating the same thing, and it's whimsical. Right? And literally magical.
And you're doing it together.
Yeah.
Like, you're having a shared experience.
Right. And I have no idea how many calories I ate that day. Probably 8,000, because I worked in fine dining, and I know, the reason my food tastes better than yours is like lots of butter and lots of salt. Right. Because fine dining cooks don't care about your cholesterol.
Right.
And you just like think about that experience versus even like, when I was on vacation with my kids, like going to an Applebee's. It was great. It was fine. We hadn't been in a restaurant in 2.5 years, so that was kind of exciting. But it's still like, oh, like quick order, like they're here. What do you want to drink? You're like, I just sat down. Give me a second. But they also know, like, what's on the Applebee's menu: Coke, Diet Coke, Sprite, beer. Right? You're not like, oh, could I look at a list of your microbrews on tap this week, or like what vintage wine do you have that will pair well with my my cheesy fries?
Yeah,
they're like, we got Franzia.
That makes me think that that's really that makes me think. We had a brief pause there. Just like, some people could view all that as snobbery, but I don't see what you're saying that as all. Like, that's trying to give people an experience around something that's universal,
right?
Which is food, which is the same thing that you have like at concerts. I think that's what you mean when you say mysticism. That's the magic of it. I think you get people together and you say, we're here and this is the central purpose, and everybody in the room kind of knows, like, we're here. You're right. The American restaurant system doesn't provide that feel at all.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Like, it can sound snobby because I'm like, oh, Wiley Dufresne, Michelin star.
Yeah,
dude, there are some street taco vendors around here where I can have the exact same experience. Right. So I'm not like, oh, you have to spend $1,000 and you have to sit down and like, no. But it's also like, Applebee's is Applebee's is Applebee's. It's fine.
Yeah,
it does the job. I occasionally I'll eat McDonald's even with my gluten allergy and like suffer the consequences because it's delicious. But it's not the same experience. It's like, I'm on the road, I need to get to where I'm going. My belly's like, I'm not sitting, like, you don't go to McDonald's with a bunch of friends and sit down. I mean, maybe back in the day when they had the real play structures and stuff, like the ball pits and all that. But you're not like, oh, let's go spend. If you were spent 2 hours in a McDonald's after you ate, like, talking with people, and they'd be like, get out.
right. Tom Segura has this bit about Whataburger, which In-N-Out Burger. Okay, one of those West Coast ones. Okay, that us on the East Coast don't know about. And he's like, if you've never been to an In-N-Out Burger, you need to get your crap together. What's wrong with you? But he says In-N-Out Burger. I can't replicate it, but basically he's like, when you pull up to the drive-thru, asks the most confrontational, like, mean question that could be asked of you, and I love it. And he goes, so you order your food at the drive-thru, you pull up, and the girl at the window says, or the guy at the window says, will you be eating in your car? This is like, shame just washes over you. You're like, and he's like, very sheepishly, he's like, yes. And then they give you a tray to put your food on in your car. And it's hilarious. It's just confirmation.
So just a quick tangent before I promise we can bring this back. When McDonald's opened the first drive-thrus in China, there were never drive-thrus before, and like, you can Google this story and look at the images and the videos, because it's so nobody knew how to use it. So McDonald's just assumed people know how to use drive-thrus, but China had never had drive-thrus. So people were waiting in line in the drive-thru, getting their food, parking their car, and taking the food back into the McDonald's to eat it.
That's funny.
Yeah, because they had no concept of, like, just get the food and shove it in your mouth in the car, because it's a different culture.
Right. And maybe they didn't have a concept of eating as purely...
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, pragmatic.
Yeah. Yeah, so they were standing, like, it was the first drive-thru, so hours wait for people to try
the
snooks.
Set aside this time to eat. Like, I'm not trying to... I'm not worried about convenience.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So back to sort of, like, Jesus, mysticism, Judaism, Schopenhauer. So I think there's a lot of things like that where Americans are just not as mystical, and they want, like, the box, the pragmatic. And I think American, even, back to... Oh, crap. My political science is waning right now. But you to the back of the foundation of America, there was this American exceptionalism, and it was basically that Americans are pragmatic, unlike any other nation. So pragmatism doesn't lend itself very well to waiting, to sitting, to dialogue.
Yeah.
right? So if you have sort of this idea that you put out that, maybe Western Christianity is dogmatic because it's sort of gotten rid of mystery, I think that makes sense, because the pragmatist in the American needs to know the answer now. And I think that's partially why when Tristan dialogues with us, hey Tristan, there's a frustration between you and me sometimes with Tristan, because Catholicism is a little more mysticism, even I think more mystic than you in some ways. So what feels very slippery to me anyway is just not dogma. They're well, there's this big dogma up here, but the way it plays out in real life could go A or B. And I'm no, you got to fill the box, man. And they're no, we don't have boxes. And I'm what do you mean you don't have boxes?
Who doesn't have boxes? You mean my point of view?
Yeah, anyone.
Huh. Well, but you were recognizing the importance of transcendence.
Yeah. Just
earlier, and
sure.
In something as simple as food, which I actually think is grand, because it's to me, that is where that is a place that we often forget to search for transcendence, is in the mundane. But ancient cultures and Eastern cultures, especially up to this day, as you were pointing out, even Western European cultures are look at that mealtime as something essentially sacred.
Ironically, Jesus did too.
Well, yeah,
right.
The first,
the whole,
exactly.
The first ritual is here's a meal.
Exactly.
And, Jesus' first miracle, and for my atheist friends, we're just granting that the Gospels are accurate for the sake of conversation. Right. First miracle. Here's some wine.
Yeah.
At a wedding.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And it's not grape juice, Southern Baptists. I'm sorry. It's wine.
Yeah. Jesus had some Kool-Aid packets in his back pocket. It's a magic trick. But
so opens his ministry with wine.
Yeah, and
closes his ministry with a meal.
The central celebration of the first century church was the Lord's Supper, and it wasn't an add-on thing that you did at the end or in the middle of a service once a month or once a week. It was the entire gathering. Church was a meal. Church was a meal.
Yeah.
First century of the church. And part of the scandal of it was that at this one table were sitting Jews and Gentiles, Roman soldiers and peasants, women and children and men, and all these nationalities, and coming together to eat together and to say that Jesus' body and blood was part of that consumption as well. But I think they tapped into something universal, or maybe even vice versa. But in that gathering around a table and sharing an event together, it doesn't even have to be an ideology, right?
Yeah.
That's the beauty. It's you're not coming around a table, even as Christians, 2,000 years later. Even if you think you are, you're not coming to a place or around a table to affirm each other's ideology or worldview. You're coming to have a shared experience. At least that's what it's supposed to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say that they tapped into something universal. And, I mean, clearly, if you're to believe the New Testament, they stole Passover, essentially.
They appropriated it, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Which, I have some Jewish friends, and, first off, every 3 weeks there's, a Jewish holiday. Mm-hmm. They just know how to do it. They're
every 3 weeks there's a feast in Catholicism.
Yeah.
In Eastern Orthodoxy.
Right. Well, so I don't know if this is true or not, but some of my liberal friends were passing around a meme that said peasants in the early Middle Ages had more holidays than today, because the papacy and the ruling elite knew that the peasants needed time off or they'd become disillusioned and rebel. So they were just like, Feast of St. Nicholas, Feast of St. Joseph, Feast of... And they just like, hey, have another party. Everyone stop working for a day.
Yeah.
Just go get drunk. It's cool.
Yep. There's a modern version of that. It's like, it's International Siblings Day.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, so, lots of feasts in the Old Testament, feasts in the New Testament, Islam, like, I think we're still in Eid. Are we still in Eid? I think we are. Like, that whole thing focused around fasting and breaking your fast, and, it's a celebration every night, and, all cultures. Like, there is... We started with German philosophy, and now we're just talking food.
That's great. I love it because I think it pertains.
And ironically, the Buddhist will be the one who isn't feasting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Or at least the devout monks, because they're...
Right. Yep. But also even in Eastern cultures, there's this very ritualized way of doing meals. I just had a friend who's a Buddhist over a couple months ago, and I told him he's like really into tea.
I was actually going to ask,
and in my mind, I'm like, okay, you're into tea, I'm into coffee. I don't know why they're the same thing, but being into tea is a completely different thing than being into coffee. Like, being into coffee is like very Western, right? In a way.
Yeah.
If I could be a little cheeky, like, it's just like, when I talk about coffee, like, I talk about acidity, and I talk about body. People that are into tea don't talk about the tea. They talk about how to drink the tea.
Yeah.
And when to sip. And how to make it. And so I thought when we were coming over for like a quote-unquote tea party, which isn't what we called it, but essentially what it was. It was like coming over for a tea party. I thought that it was going to be like, he was going to tell me about teas, like why he prefers
Oolong,
this tea to that tea and
powder,
that kind of stuff, and that I would learn all that. But he wasn't even into that. He's like, whatever tea you like, it's what you like. If you like black tea, that's fine. If you like herbal tea, that's cool. What he really wanted to talk about was how long to steep it, how to pour it, and like when to drink it. So like stuff like having to wait for a very particular amount of time in between like sip 1 and sip 2 because you needed to like meditate on what like that first sip meant. I quickly realized when he came over that I thought that I invited my friend over to an informal event to hang out, but he was under the impression that I was inviting him to formally teach me about tea. And it was a religious experience.
Yeah.
And it was just tea.
Yeah.
But
so
it was way more than tea.
What's fascinating is when you look into the history of tea in China and Japan especially, like their preparation for tea time starts like 2 hours before. Yeah. If not like days, but like you said, it's about like the temperature has to be exactly 210 degrees. Mm-hmm. Like, because if it's 212, you're going to burn the tea, and it's got to steep depending on the type of tea, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, like precise. Mm-hmm. And then you pulled it like, when I watch Americans take their Lipton tea bag and just leave the bag in the cup. Because like at heart I'm a foodie, and I like some of the rituals, but I'm like no, there's a right way to do stuff, and I'm like no, like take that bag out after 2 minutes. Americans, if you're using a tea bag, 2 minutes, pull the bag out. Don't squeeze it either. All the stuff in there that were like you don't want the stuff that's in the tea. Like, just take the bag out, throw it away. It doesn't matter how wet it is. Right. That's what you're like. And that's if you're using loose leaf, it's completely different. But yeah, there's like we're American though, we don't do that. Mm-hmm. Right, we want our box, we want our calorie fill, our caffeine, and we want to get the crap out.
See, I think it's interesting that you're relating this to Americanism. We haven't said the word, but American consumerism. I think consumerism is like kind of what we're talking about, which is a part of, I think, who we are. And unfortunately, we are exporting it all around the world. That kind of consumerism and that part of our culture that that I don't like, although there's a lot of things about Americanism that I actually do like. I don't want to crap on America.
Yeah, I
all the
mean, I
time.
love our TVs and movies. And...
Yeah, we have some of the best artists these days, and I don't know. But even just like our libertarian independent streak, give or take. There's always give or take with this. Some things, there's some things about Americanism that I really like, but that seems like a whole other episode. What I wanted to say is that because I'm a Christian and have been basically a professional theologian, although a lay theologian, I've been a minister, so that and been studying theology for pretty much 20 years. Like, I just have such a broader framework for this stuff, because I don't think of Catholicism as Catholicism is not as American as Protestantism is in my mind.
Yeah. Though there is a form of American Catholicism that's consumerist, I think.
Sure.
Like
yeah.
A lot of my cultural Catholic friend,
yeah,
they go maybe Christmas Mass, probably Easter.
Yeah.
Their kids are definitely in CCD.
Yeah.
Which is funny because they're not going to regular church or Mass. They're dropping their kids off for Sunday school CCD to get confirmed.
Uh-huh.
And and partially they've said, well, grandma's not going to give a check unless they're confirmed. If that isn't consumerism, pimp your kids out. I mean, they're not pimping their kids out because their kids are the ones getting the money in the end. But
yeah,
right. And then there are so that seems like an American Catholicism. I haven't traveled to South America, but I can't imagine the average Brazilian going to Mass simply so their kid can get CCD and then stopping. Mm-hmm. That may be changing.
Yeah, I wouldn't know. I get your point. What I was getting at was this obsession with dogma, I think, existed before America existed within Western Christianity, especially.
Yeah.
And it's manifested in even the way they thought about theological disputes is interesting in that we're going to have this debate and somebody's going to win. So we're going to have this debate about the Trinity. Somebody's going to win this debate. And that debate is called such and such council.
Yeah.
Right. And then the winner is essentially, they don't put it this way, but the winner is declared. And now here is the doctrine as stated by the council of Nicene or Athanasius or so on and so forth. And now this is heresy and this is orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. And there's this very straight line. Now orthodoxy is not exactly the same thing as capital T truth. There's a little bit of wiggle room there where it's not as if these discussions can't come up again and there can't be revisions and there can't be rethinking. But that's very different than, say, Judaism, which is basically put it all in, right? Put the whole debate in and we'll show you the dialogue, and both of those things will be part of the Talmud. So the debate continues. Yeah. So I just wonder if there's a relationship between this idea that Jesus is the end of the law, potentially meaning Jesus is the end of end of conversation. I'm not stating that as dogma. I don't want to get any pushback, accusations that I'm pushing towards relativism. Yeah. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah.
So sort of, you know what I'm getting at, right? Yeah. There's this relationship between this idea, okay, Jesus is the solution to this particular problem, and Christianity's historical obsession with getting the doctrine right. And I think the difference, I think Protestantism and Catholicism share that quote-unquote obsession, which is a strong word. The difference is that Protestantism rejects the magisterium, and so is not as bound to the creeds and this idea of sola scriptura, and that's a whole other like theological problem, because then it's like, well, if the scripture's the authority, but we have to debate about what it means, how strong is that authority?
Right. Well, and cover your children's ears. I'm not going to swear, but one of the snarkier atheists I follow posted a thing. It was like, the difference between horseplay and ponyplay is so striking that we should have zero confidence that we understand translating ancient texts. And if you don't know what ponyplay is, maybe look it up with Google safety on.
Yeah.
But like they're the same. There's like essentially showing how bad translation can be, right? Or how nuanced it can be, because there are probably English listeners who don't know the difference between horseplay and ponyplay.
Yeah.
And now you're going back 2,000 years to this ancient text. You're not an original Hebrew,
right,
Aramaic, or Greek speaker, Middle Greek. And now you come across this phrase that says horseplay. Well, does it?
Right.
So, like, yeah, there is a problem with sola scriptura there.
Well, yeah.
And
there's
what, sort of to wrap that up, one of the things I was thinking, because I wasn't even thinking going back as far as Athanasius and Nicene, is, sort of American evangelicalism has this obsession with, capital T truth in the right boxes and everything. And whereas it feels like you're saying, and I think it feels like other flavors of Christianity and or geographical locations of even evangelical Christianity are a little less concerned about ticking exactly all the right boxes. Like, there's the right box of, like, Jesus was God, he rose from the dead, like, the magisterium says this is the meaning of this text, but it's not sort of like this fundamentalism. And I wonder if that's because Europe went through it with a lot of hundreds of years of bloody wars and people being tortured and burned, and they were like, you know what, F it. Like, my neighbor is more important than whether the Pope is God's emissary or if we should be part of the Church of England. Like, let's just... And America didn't go through all of that. In fact, while Europe was burning, like, the Pilgrims were like, hey, let's go over here. And so, very uniquely, we start off as a Protestant religious...
And not just a
zealot,
Protestant one. Like, separatists. Right, the conservatives are the ones who came.
Yeah, and they're like, we can do our thing over here without being bothered. So Europe's burning. Legit, the Inquisition is still going on. There are we have some witch trials here in Salem. But very quickly people are like, let's not do that again. Right? So there's a whole different, like, slide. So American can be more fundamentalist because it didn't have the problems that Europe faced with fundamentalism.
Plus, and I'm agreeing with you, plus... with this new frontier, not as if there weren't Native Americans living on the plains, but that's not the way that I don't think that's the way that the early colonists saw it. They just saw like open fields essentially.
Yeah,
and so these open fields, like if you were in North Carolina and the religion that you grew up and loved was like, going liberal, like going progressive, you're like, I'm going to move to Missouri.
Right.
And start my own denomination there.
Yeah.
And there's this relationship with...
Or Boston Bay kicks you out.
Yeah.
Like, Roger Williams, you're a heretic. He's like, cool, I have Rhode Island now.
Right.
Or William Penn's like, here's Pennsylvania. Like, legit, states were founded.
Exactly. And there's this relationship between the American idea of freedom and religion. And we're still in the midst of those kinds of culture wars, and maybe that's a good place to stop.
Yeah, well, and and it's ironic that, to me, that we have lost our mysticism amidst that.
Let's talk about that
on the next episode.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope you're having a good week, staying cool. think there's another heat wave coming.
Is there?
There is. Fun times.
Mm.
Not as bad as Europe, which like melted last week.
Yeah, like France was on fire.
Yeah. And the world is on fire, right?
Yeah.
On that happy note.
Yes.
Have a great week.